Once upon a time, in a grand kingdom, where tradition was everything and appearances meant the world, there lived a king who simply could not ride a horse. This was not just any king, but a monarch whose every move was watched by the court, chronicled by scribes, and whispered about by the people. And in this kingdom, riding a horse wasn't just a hobby, it was a symbol of power, dignity, and royal competence. The king's name was Edmund the Gentle. He was beloved for his kindness, his wisdom, and his generous heart. But there was one thing King Edmund dreaded above all else: the annual royal procession. This was the day when the entire city would gather to see their king, resplendent in shining armor, ride through the streets on his majestic steed. Children would wave flags, trumpets would sound, and the royal family would smile and wave from their horses. For most kings, this was a moment of pride. For Edmund, it was a nightmare in shining armor. The day of the procession dawned bright and clear. The city was abuzz with excitement. Banners fluttered from every window, and the scent of fresh bread and flowers filled the air. King Edmund stood in his chamber, staring at his reflection. His armor gleamed. His crown sat perfectly atop his head, and his royal cloak billowed behind him. But his eyes betrayed his nerves. His loyal advisor, Sir Reginald, entered the room. "Your Majesty, the people await. Your horse Thunderclap is ready." Edmund swallowed hard. Thunderclap, the same horse from last year. Sir Reginald nodded. "He's the finest in the royal stables, sire." Edmund remembered last year's fiasco all too well. Thunderclap, a beast of muscle and spirit, had a particular dislike for royal cloaks and a fondness for sudden, unpredictable movements. But there was no turning back now. The king made his way to the palace courtyard where the royal family and court awaited. Thunderclap stood proudly, his mane braided with ribbons, his saddle polished to a mirror shine. The crowd cheered as the king approached. With as much dignity as he could muster, Edmund placed one foot in the stirrup, grabbed the saddle, and attempted to swing himself up. Unfortunately, his royal cloak caught on the saddle horn, and instead of mounting gracefully, he found himself tangled and teetering. For a brief, glorious moment, it looked as if he might recover. But then, Thunderclap, sensing the hesitation, shifted his weight. The next few seconds happened in slow motion. The king's foot slipped, his crown tilted, and his scepter clattered to the ground. With a dramatic oof, King Edmund tumbled off the side of the horse, landing squarely on his back in a pile of flower petals meant for the parade. The courtyard fell silent. Even the birds seemed to pause. Then, as if on cue, Thunderclap snorted, and a single petal landed gently on the king's nose. For a moment, there was only stunned silence. Then a small child giggled. The giggles spread, and soon the entire crowd was laughing, not in mockery, but in genuine amusement and affection. The king, ever the good sport, sat up, brushed petals from his face, and gave a theatrical bow. The crowd erupted in cheers. Sir Reginald rushed over, concern etched on his face. "Are you all right, Your Majesty?" Edmund grinned. "Never better, Reginald, though I think Thunderclap may have won this round." The rest of the procession was conducted with the king riding in a grand, flower-adorned carriage, waving to the crowds with a sheepish smile. The story of the royal tumble spread through the kingdom like wildfire. Children reenacted the scene in the streets, and artists painted humorous portraits of the king surrounded by petals and a smug-looking Thunderclap. But rather than diminish his reputation, the incident made King Edmund even more beloved. He became known as the king who could laugh at himself, who wasn't afraid to be human in front of his people. The royal tumble became an annual tradition, with the king tossing flower petals to the crowd and sharing a laugh with his subjects. Behind the scenes, however, the king's advisors were in a frenzy. "We must do something about this," they whispered. "The king must learn to ride, or at least look like he can." Secret plans were hatched midnight, riding lessons were arranged, and the royal tailors were instructed to design a cloak that wouldn't catch on anything. But for King Edmund, the memory of that fateful day was a reminder that sometimes the best way to rule was with humility, humour, and a willingness to fall gracefully or not in front of those you serve. And so, in the grand halls of history, King Edmund's most embarrassing public fall became his most endearing moment. The king who couldn't ride a horse had in his own way ridden straight into the hearts of his people. As the years passed, the legend grew. Bards sang songs of the Petal King and Thunderclap, became a local celebrity, often seen munching apples in the palace gardens. The annual procession continued, but now it was less about royal grandeur and more about community laughter and the gentle reminder that even kings can have bad days. And so, as you drift off to sleep, remember sometimes the greatest leaders are those who can laugh at themselves, get up after a fall and keep waving to the crowd petals and all. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with gentle horses and soft landings. After the infamous royal tumble king Edmund the Gentle became a living legend in his own court. The people adored him, the children laughed with him, and the story of the king and the flower petals was retold at every festival. But inside the palace walls, the mood was far less jovial. The king's advisors, led by the ever-loyal Sir Reginald, held an emergency meeting in the candlelit council chamber. The agenda was clear: Operation Teach the King to Ride, or at least not fall off. Sir Reginald, pacing anxiously, addressed the gathered dignitaries. "We cannot have His Majesty tumbling into flower beds every year. The kingdom's dignity is at stake. We must act discreetly, of course." Thus began the most secretive, and as it would turn out, the most comically disastrous series of midnight riding lessons in royal history. The plan was simple in theory. Under the cover of darkness, when the palace slept and the city's eyes were closed, King Edmund would be escorted to the royal stables. There, the kingdom's finest riding instructor, Lady Beatrice, a formidable woman with the patience of a saint and the voice of a drill sergeant, would attempt to teach the king the noble art of horsemanship. The first lesson began on a moonless night. Sir Reginald, dressed all in black except for his gleaming silver helmet, which he forgot to remove, tiptoed to the king's chambers. He gently knocked. "Your Majesty, it's time." King Edmund, already in his pyjamas, blinked sleepily. "Time for what, Reginald?" "The sun isn't even up." Sir Reginald whispered conspiratorially. "Your secret riding lessons, sire. The fate of the kingdom depends on it." Edmund sighed, but allowed himself to be bundled into a cloak and led half awake through the palace corridors. They crept past guards who pretended not to notice through the kitchens, where the night chef offered them a suspiciously large sandwich, and finally out to the stables. Lady Beatrice awaited them, arms crossed, a lantern in one hand and a carrot in the other. "Majesty," she said, bowing, "tonight we tame the beast, Thunderclap." The infamous royal steed stood in his stall, munching contentedly. He eyed the king with what could only be described as mild amusement. "First lesson," Lady Beatrice announced. "Approach the horse with confidence. Horses can smell fear." King Edmund took a deep breath and stepped forward. Thunderclap sniffed him, then sneezed, sending the king's cloak fluttering. "Very good." Lady Beatrice lied. "Now place your foot in the stirrup and—" But Edmund, still groggy, missed the stirrup entirely and nearly toppled face first into the hay. Sir Reginald winced. Lady Beatrice did not flinch. "Again, Majesty." So began a long night of mounting and dismounting of cloaks, catching on saddles of boots stuck in stirrups, and of Thunderclap occasionally wandering off in search of snacks. Lady Beatrice demonstrated, Sir Reginald offered encouragement, and King Edmund tried his best. At one point the king managed to climb onto Thunderclap's back, only to discover that he had mounted the horse backwards. The sight of the king-regal cloak billowing facing Thunderclap's tail was so absurd that even Lady Beatrice had to stifle a laugh. "Progress," she declared. "Next time we'll try facing the right way." The lessons continued each night. The palace staff, sworn to secrecy, developed elaborate cover stories. "His Majesty is working late on matters of state," they'd say. Or, "The king is conducting a midnight inspection of the royal gardens." Rumours swirled, but no one guessed the truth. Some nights the lessons went better than others. There were moments when King Edmund almost looked like a real rider, until Thunderclap, bored with the proceedings, would trot suddenly, sending the king clutching desperately to the saddle. Other times the king would dismount triumphantly, only to trip over his own feet and land in the hay. One particularly memorable night, Lady Beatrice introduced a new training aid, the practice horse, a wooden contraption on springs. "We'll start with this," she said. "No surprises, no sudden movements." King Edmund climbed aboard. The springs creaked. Sir Reginald gave the wooden horse a gentle push, and it rocked back and forth. The king, determined to look the part, drew himself up, chest out, chin high. "See," he said, beaming, "I'm a natural." Just then the springs gave way with a loud twang, and the practice horse collapsed, depositing the king gently onto a pile of straw. The stables echoed with laughter, Lady Beatrice's booming guffaw, Sir Reginald's snorts, and even it seemed Thunderclap's whinny of amusement. Despite the setbacks, the king's spirits never faltered. He joked about his midnight rodeos and began to look forward to the lessons, if only for the camaraderie and the chance to escape the pressures of the throne for a few hours each night. As the weeks passed, King Edmund did improve slowly, awkwardly but undeniably. He learned how to sit tall in the saddle, how to hold the reins, and even how to coax Thunderclap into a gentle walk around the paddock. Lady Beatrice, ever the taskmaster, praised his progress, though she still kept a pile of straw handy just in case. But the secrecy of the operation was always at risk. One night, as the king was practicing a particularly tricky maneuver turning Thunderclap in a tight circle, a sudden commotion erupted at the palace gates. A delegation from a neighbouring kingdom had arrived unexpectedly seeking an audience with the king. Panic ensued. Sir Reginald rushed to intercept the visitors, while Lady Beatrice hurriedly helped the king dismount and brush straw from his hair. "Remember, Majesty," she whispered, "if anyone asks, you were inspecting the royal stables." Edmund nodded, straightened his cloak and strode out to meet the delegation, trying his best to look regal, and not at all like a man who had just spent an hour riding in circles. The midnight lessons became the palace's worst-kept secret. Servants would exchange knowing glances, stable boys would leave extra apples for Thunderclap, and the night chef began preparing victory snacks for the king's return. Even the palace cats seemed to sense that something unusual was afoot, often gathering to watch the proceedings with feline indifference. Through it all, King Edmund's determination never wavered. He was, after all, the king who couldn't ride a horse, but he was also the king who refused to give up. Each night brought new challenges, new tumbles, and new reasons to laugh. And so, under the moonlit sky, in the quiet of the royal stables, the king and his loyal companions waged their secret campaign. They battled stubborn horses, rebellious cloaks, and the ever-present threat of discovery. But above all, they discovered that sometimes the greatest victories are not the ones won in public, but the ones earned in the quiet moments of perseverance, friendship, and laughter. As the dawn approached, King Edmund would return to his chambers tired but content. He knew he still had much to learn, but he also knew that he was not alone. With Sir Reginald, Lady Beatrice, and even Thunderclap by his side, he felt ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring, even if those challenges involved flower petals and the occasional tumble. And so, as you drift off to sleep, remember, even kings have secrets, even kings have struggles, and even kings need a little help from their friends. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with gentle lessons, loyal companions, and the courage to try again, no matter how many times you fall. In the weeks following King Edmund's secret midnight riding lessons, the palace began to buzz with anticipation for the next grand event, the Spring Festival Parade. This was no ordinary procession. It was the highlight of the royal calendar, with visiting dignitaries, foreign ambassadors, and thousands of loyal subjects expected to line the city's cobbled streets. The centerpiece, as always, would be the king himself, riding at the head of the parade, waving regally from atop his noble steed. But for King Edmund, the thought of another public ride after last year's legendary tumble made his stomach twist into knots. Despite his nightly efforts and Lady Beatrice's unwavering encouragement, his skills remained, let's say, developing. He could now mount Thunderclap without falling off immediately, but the idea of performing in front of a cheering crowd was another matter entirely. It was Sir Reginald, ever the loyal adviser, who first broached the idea one evening as the king nursed a cup of chamomile tea after a particularly bumpy lesson. Your Majesty, Reginald began choosing his words carefully, perhaps for the sake of the kingdom's dignity and your own safety. We might consider an alternative approach for the parade. King Edmund raised an eyebrow. You mean I should walk? Reginald shook his head. No, sire, I mean a decoy. The king blinked. A decoy? Reginald nodded, lowering his voice conspiratorially. A stand-in. Someone who can ride in your place dressed in your royal regalia. The crowd will never know. King Edmund considered this. On the one hand, the idea seemed cowardly. On the other, it was undeniably practical. And he had to admit the thought of not tumbling into another pile of flower petals was rather appealing. And so Operation Royal Decoy was born. The search for the perfect stand-in began at once. The palace guards were considered first, but none quite matched the king's slender build or gentle manner. The royal cousins were next, but they were either too tall, too short, or too fond of practical jokes to be trusted with such a delicate task. It was Lady Beatrice who finally suggested the ideal candidate, Thomas the palace's junior footman. Thomas was a quiet young man with a remarkable resemblance to the king, same sandy hair, same gentle eyes, and most importantly, a natural talent for horsemanship. He had grown up on a farm and could ride as easily as he could walk. When Thomas was summoned to the king's private chamber and told of the plan, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Me, your majesty, pretend to be you," Edmund smiled warmly. "You'd be doing your king and your kingdom a great service, Thomas. And don't worry, you'll be well rewarded. Plus you get to wear the royal cloak. Just be careful with the saddle horn." Thomas grinned. "I'll do my best, sire." The days leading up to the parade were filled with secret rehearsals. Thomas was fitted for a replica of the king's ceremonial armour and practiced the royal wave until his arm ached. Lady Beatrice drilled him on every detail, the tilt of the chin, the regal nod, the serene smile. Even Sir Reginald offered tips on how to look thoughtfully kingly. Meanwhile, King Edmund practiced his own role, that of a slightly less visible monarch. On the day of the parade, he would ride in a closed carriage further back in the procession, waving discreetly through a curtained window. The official story was that the king was preserving his voice for the festival's closing speech. The morning of the parade dawned bright and clear. The city was alive with excitement. Trumpets blared, banners snapped in the breeze, and the scent of spring flowers filled the air. In the royal stables, Thomas was dressed in full regalia, his face half hidden beneath the king's plumed helmet. Thunderclap, freshly groomed and unusually cooperative, stood ready. Sir Reginald gave Thomas a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Remember, keep your back straight, wave slowly, and whatever you do, don't sneeze." Thomas nodded, nerves and excitement warring on his face. The parade began with all the pomp and ceremony the kingdom could muster. At the head rode King Edmund, looking every inch the regal monarch. The crowd cheered, waving flags and tossing petals. Thomas waved back, his heart pounding, but he kept his composure. He guided Thunderclap through the city streets with practiced ease, never once losing his balance or his smile. Behind him, in the comfort of his carriage, the real King Edmund peeked through the curtains, watching the spectacle unfold. He felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. The people were happy the parade was a success, and not a single person suspected the truth. Yet he couldn't help but feel a pang of envy at how effortlessly Thomas played his part. As the parade wound its way through the city, a few sharp-eyed courtiers began to notice small differences. "The king looks taller today," one whispered. "Did you see the way he handled that horse?" "Remarkable," another exclaimed. But the excitement of the day swept away any doubts. At the festival's end, Thomas guided Thunderclap back to the palace stables, where Lady Beatrice and Sir Reginald greeted him with applause. King Edmund slipped quietly from his carriage and joined them, clapping Thomas on the back. "Well done, Thomas," he said sincerely. "You've saved the day and my dignity." Thomas blushed. "It was an honour, sire, though I must admit the armour is heavier than it looks." That evening, as the city celebrated, the king and his advisors gathered in the private dining hall. They toasted to Thomas's success and to the smoothest parade in living memory. The secret of the royal decoy was safe, at least for now, but the tale didn't end there. Word of the king's remarkable horsemanship spread far and wide. Foreign ambassadors sent letters of congratulation. The royal portraitist was commissioned to capture the moment for posterity. And most amusingly, the palace received several requests from noble families hoping to arrange riding lessons with the king himself. King Edmund, ever the good sport, politely declined. Perhaps another time, he'd say with a smile. Yet as the days passed, the king found himself reflecting on the whole affair. He realized that while he might never be a master horseman, he had something just as valuable: the loyalty of his friends, the ingenuity of his advisors, and the courage to laugh at himself. And thanks to Thomas, he had a new appreciation for the unsung heroes who made the kingdom run smoothly behind the scenes. In the years that followed, the story of the royal decoy became a cherished secret among the palace staff. Thomas was promoted to royal equerry and became a trusted confidant of the king. Lady Beatrice continued her midnight lessons, though now with a little less urgency and a lot more laughter. And Sir Reginald, ever vigilant, kept a close eye on the royal schedule, just in case another parade loomed on the horizon. As for King Edmund, he embraced his role as the king who couldn't ride a horse. He made light of his shortcomings, shared stories of his tumbles with guests, and even commissioned a small statue for the palace gardens, a bronze king waving from the ground with a bemused horse looking on. And so, in the gentle twilight of the kingdom, as the stars twinkled above the palace towers, the king and his companions would often gather in the stables, sharing tales and laughter. For in the end, it wasn't the riding or the falling that mattered most. It was the friendships, the loyalty, and the joy of facing life's challenges together. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember, even the greatest kings sometimes need a little help from their friends. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else take the reins, if only for a day. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with loyal companions, clever disguises, and the quiet courage to be yourself. In the royal kingdom, where tradition and spectacle were woven into the very fabric of daily life, nothing was more iconic or more problematic than the ceremonial armor worn by the monarch. For King Edmund, the armor was both a symbol of authority and a source of endless frustration, especially when it came to riding his not-so-trusty steed, Thunderclap. The ceremonial armor was a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It gleamed in the sunlight, adorned with intricate engravings of lions, eagles, and the royal crest. The breastplate was polished to a mirror shine, the helmet sported a magnificent plume, and the boots reached nearly to the king's knees. It was designed to impress foreign dignitaries and inspire awe in the people. Unfortunately, it was also designed by someone who had clearly never tried to mount a horse while wearing 50 pounds of metal. The trouble began each year as the spring tournament approached. This was a time when knights from across the land gathered to compete in jousting, archery, and of course the grand parade. The king was expected to lead the procession, resplendent in full armor astride his horse. It was a tradition as old as the kingdom itself, and one that filled King Edmund with dread. On the morning of the tournament, the palace was a flurry of activity. Pages polished armor, squires brushed horses, and the royal tailor made last-minute adjustments to the king's cloak. In the king's chamber, Sir Reginald and Lady Beatrice stood ready to assist with the most challenging task of all, getting King Edmund dressed. The process began with the undergarments, a quilted gambeson, to soften the blow of any accidental falls. Next came the leggings, then the heavy boots. Sir Reginald struggled to fasten the greaves while Lady Beatrice adjusted the breastplate. The helmet with its extravagant plume was placed carefully on the king's head. By the end, King Edmund looked every inch the warrior king, except for the fact that he could barely move. "How do I look?" he asked, attempting a regal pose. "Majestic, sire," Sir Reginald replied, though he couldn't help but notice that the king's arms stuck out at odd angles. "Like a true knight," Lady Beatrice agreed, suppressing a smile. The real challenge, however, was yet to come. Thunderclap awaited in the courtyard, already saddled and looking suspiciously amused. The crowd was gathering, eager for the spectacle to begin. With great ceremony, King Edmund was led to the waiting horse. The first hurdle was the mounting block, a sturdy wooden step designed to help knights climb onto their steeds. Unfortunately, the combination of slippery metal boots and a too-long cloak made the task nearly impossible. The king placed one armored foot on the block, grabbed the saddle horn, and attempted to swing his leg over Thunderclap's back. The armor, however, had other ideas. The greaves locked at the knee, the breastplate dug into his stomach, and the helmet shifted, obscuring his vision. For a moment, it looked as though the king might succeed. But then, with a loud metallic clank, his foot slipped, and he toppled sideways, landing in an undignified heap at Thunderclap's hooves. The crowd gasped, then fell silent. Thunderclap, ever the professional, stood perfectly still, as if waiting for the king to try again. Sir Reginald and Lady Beatrice rushed to help, struggling to lift the king to his feet. The armor made every movement awkward. When they finally managed to stand him up, his helmet was askew, and his cloak was wrapped around his legs like a curtain. "Perhaps we should try a different approach, sire," Lady Beatrice suggested diplomatically. After several more attempts, each more comical than the last, it was decided that the king would mount from a raised platform. Even then, it took the combined efforts of 3 squires, 2 pages, and a very patient Thunderclap to get King Edmund into the saddle. Once mounted, a new set of problems emerged. The armor was so stiff that the king could barely bend his knees. He sat bolt upright, unable to lean forward or turn his head. The helmet's plume bobbed precariously with every movement, threatening to topple off at any moment. As the parade began, The king did his best to maintain his dignity. He waved stiffly to the crowd, who responded with enthusiastic cheers. Children pointed and laughed, not out of disrespect, but because the king looked more like a wind-up toy than a fearsome warrior. The real trouble started when Thunderclap, bored with the slow pace, decided to liven things up. With a sudden snort, he broke into a gentle trot. The king, caught off guard, bounced in the saddle like a sack of potatoes. The armor rattled and clanged with every step, drawing even more attention. At one point, the king tried to adjust his position, only to find that his gauntlet was stuck to the saddle horn. He tugged and twisted, but the glove refused to budge. The crowd watched in amusement as the king waged a silent battle with his own armor. Meanwhile, Sir Reginald and Lady Beatrice followed anxiously on foot, ready to intervene at a moment's notice. They exchanged worried glances as the king's helmet began to slip forward, covering his eyes. "Steady, sire," Sir Reginald called out. "I can't see," the king replied, his voice muffled by the helmet. Lady Beatrice rushed forward and with a deft hand straightened the helmet just in time for the king to see the low-hanging banner ahead. He ducked instinctively, but the armor prevented him from bending. The banner swept over his head, knocking the plume from his helmet and leaving the king with a crown of ribbons. The crowd erupted in laughter and applause. The king, ever the good sport, managed a sheepish grin and waved to his adoring subjects. By the end of the parade, King Edmund was exhausted. The armor felt twice as heavy and every muscle ached. But as he dismounted this time with the help of a small army of attendants, he couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. That evening, as the sun set over the kingdom, the royal family gathered in the great hall for the traditional post-parade feast. The story of the king's fashion disaster was already spreading, and the palace was filled with laughter and good-natured teasing. King Edmund raised his goblet in a toast. To tradition, to laughter, and to the hope that next year's armor comes with instructions, the hall erupted in cheers. From that day forward, the ceremonial armor became a running joke in the kingdom. Artists painted humorous portraits of the king in his gleaming, unwieldy suit. Children played at knights and kings clanking around in pots and pans. Even Thunderclap seemed to enjoy the attention, posing proudly for visitors. But beneath the laughter, there was a sense of affection and respect for the king, who faced his challenges with humility and good humor. King Edmund may never have mastered the art of riding in armor, but he had won the hearts of his people, and that in the end was the greatest victory of all. So as you settle in for the night, remember, sometimes the most memorable moments are born from our greatest mishaps. May your dreams be filled with shiny armor, gentle horses, and the courage to laugh at yourself no matter how many times you fall. Good night, and may you always find the humor in life's little disasters. For most monarchs, the art of making excuses is as essential as the art of ruling itself. But for King Edmund the Gentle, whose equestrian skills were the stuff of palace legend, and not in a good way, excuses became a royal specialty. After a series of public tumbles, armor mishaps, and a parade featuring a decoy, the king's aversion to horse riding was no secret to his closest advisors. What remained a secret, at least to the public, was the king's remarkable creativity in finding ways to avoid the saddle. It all began with the annual spring hunt, a tradition where the king was expected to lead the nobility on a grand ride through the royal forests. For weeks, the palace buzzed with preparations, hunting horns, polished hounds trained, and the king's own mount Thunderclap groomed to perfection. Yet, as the day approached, King Edmund's anxiety grew. On the morning of the hunt, Sir Reginald entered the king's chamber to find Edmund gazing out the window, a look of deep concern on his face. "Your Majesty, the nobles are assembled and Thunderclap awaits," Reginald announced. Edmund sighed dramatically. "Reginald, I fear I cannot ride today. I was up all night with a terrible royal headache, the kind that only afflicts kings, you know." Reginald raised an eyebrow. "A royal headache, sire?" "Yes," Edmund replied, clutching his temples for effect. "It comes on suddenly, especially when I think about riding." Thus began the king's long and illustrious career as a master of excuses. Each event brought a new and increasingly inventive reason to stay off horseback. The sudden storm. At the summer festival, with the skies clear and the sun shining, the king declared, "I sense a storm approaching. The air is heavy with atmospheric foreboding. It would be unwise to risk riding in such conditions." When a page pointed out that not a cloud was in sight, Edmund nodded sagely. "The most dangerous storms are the ones you don't see coming." The urgent state affairs. During the harvest parade, as the royal horse was led out, the king clutched a stack of documents. Alas, urgent matters of state require my immediate attention. The kingdom's grain reserves must be reviewed personally. I cannot in good conscience leave such a task unfinished. He retreated to his study, where he spent the afternoon composing poetry about wheat. The unruly cloak. On the day of the winter procession, Edmund emerged from his chambers, wrapped in a cloak so long and elaborate that it trailed behind him like a river. I fear my ceremonial cloak is too magnificent for horseback today. I would not wish to risk damaging such a masterpiece or tripping the royal steed. The court tailor, who had been up all night sewing extra fabric, received a discreet wink from the king. The mysterious allergy. When asked to lead the royal garden tour on horseback, Edmund coughed delicately. It seems I have developed a sudden allergy to horsehair, or perhaps it's the flowers. In any case, it would be unwise to expose myself or the kingdom to such risk. He proceeded to lead the tour on foot, pausing often to sneeze theatrically. The philosophical objection. At one particularly memorable council meeting, a foreign ambassador invited the king to join a ceremonial ride. Edmund pondered gravely. You see, in my studies of philosophy, I have come to believe that true leadership is not about being above others, literally or figuratively. By walking among my people, I demonstrate humility and solidarity. The ambassador, impressed by such wisdom, nodded in agreement. The unfortunate foot. On the eve of the royal ball, the king arrived limping. I seem to have twisted my ankle while meditating. It is a royal tradition to meditate vigorously before important events. Sir Reginald, who had seen the king practicing dance steps in his slippers, said nothing. The disappearing saddle. One morning, as the court gathered for a sunrise ride, the king announced with a look of genuine shock, "My saddle has vanished. Without it, I cannot possibly ride. Until it is found, I must regrettably remain on foot." The saddle was later discovered in the palace kitchen, being used as a seat by the royal cat. The diplomatic delay. When a neighbouring queen proposed a joint ride to symbolise unity, Edmund smiled apologetically. Alas, pressing diplomatic correspondence requires my attention. I must pen a letter of great importance, one that cannot wait. He spent the afternoon composing an ode to quill pens. The astrological alarm. On the day of the solar eclipse, the king consulted the royal astrologer. "The stars are not favourable for riding today," he declared solemnly. "Mars is in retrograde and Mercury is somewhere inconvenient. It would be reckless to tempt fate." The astrologer, who had been bribed with a basket of peaches, nodded vigorously. The royal stand-in. Finally, at the annual Founders' Day parade, Edmund unveiled his most audacious excuse yet. "This year I wish to honour the unsung heroes of the realm. Therefore I shall appoint a worthy subject to ride in my place as a symbol of the people's strength." Thomas the footman, already in costume, took the reins with a grin. Through all these escapades, the court grew accustomed to the king's antics. The nobles placed bets on what excuse he would invent next. The palace staff began suggesting ever more outlandish scenarios. "Perhaps, sire, you have developed an allergy to saddles, or maybe the horses are fasting for religious reasons." Yet far from diminishing his stature, King Edmund's excuses became part of his legend. The people admired his wit, the children imitated his performances, and the kingdom's poets composed verses in his honour. No king rode less nor ruled with more aplomb than Edmund the gentle, wise and calm. For when the saddle called, he'd always find a reason to stay grounded of the cleverest kind. Behind the scenes, of course, his advisers sometimes despaired. Sir Reginald kept a running list of the king's excuses, while Lady Beatrice lobbied for a royal decree making walking the official mode of transport. But in the quiet moments when the palace was still and the moonlight streamed through the windows, King Edmund would smile to himself. He knew he was no knight on horseback, but he was a king who understood his own limits and who could turn even his shortcomings into moments of joy and laughter for his people. And so as you drift off to sleep, remember sometimes the best way to face a challenge is with a little creativity, a dash of humour, and the confidence to say, "Not today, thank you." May your dreams be filled with clever solutions, gentle laughter, and the freedom to walk your own path on foot or otherwise. Good night, and may your excuses always be as charming as King Edmund's. Part 6. The Court's Whisper. jokes and songs about the king. Within the grand halls and bustling corridors of King Edmund's palace, laughter was as much a part of daily life as royal decrees and ceremonial banquets. While the kingdom adored their gentle king, the palace staff, courtiers, and even visiting dignitaries couldn't help but find endless amusement in his well-known struggles with horsemanship. And as with any great royal quirk, the king's adventures and misadventures soon became the stuff of whispered jokes and catchy songs, shared in the kitchens, echoed in the servants' quarters, and even hummed by the guards on night watch. It all began innocently enough. After the infamous royal tumble and the parade of creative excuses, the palace found itself in need of a little comic relief. The royal jester, always quick to spot an opportunity, composed a playful ditty titled "The King and the Horse." It was a simple, cheerful tune, sung to the rhythm of clattering hooves and punctuated by the sound of a gentle thud whenever the king's character hit the ground. The chorus went something like this: "Oh, the king rode out with a crown on his head, but soon he was walking and blushing bright red. For the horse was a beast both noble and sly, and the king, oh the king, could but wave goodbye." The song was an instant hit. Servants sang it while polishing silver cooks hummed it as they stirred their pots, and even Lady Beatrice was caught tapping her foot to the melody. The king, ever the good sport, pretended not to notice, though he was often seen smiling at the sound drifting through the palace windows. Soon the jokes began to multiply. At banquets, the court's wittiest minds would compete to see who could invent the cleverest quip about the king's riding woes. Why did the king bring a ladder to the stables, one would ask? To mount his royal dignity, another would reply to peals of laughter. The jesters, emboldened by the king's tolerance, added new verses to their songs, each more elaborate than the last. One particularly creative page wrote a short play performed in secret for the kitchen staff. In it, a bumbling king, played by the page himself, wearing a mop for a wig, attempted to mount a wooden hobby horse, only to be thwarted by a mischievous cloak and a runaway boot. The audience was in stitches, and the performance became a regular event, though always out of sight of the more serious-minded courtiers. But the humour didn't stay confined to the lower ranks. Even the nobles, who prided themselves on decorum, couldn't resist joining in. At one masquerade ball, a group of young lords arrived dressed as horses, complete with painted cardboard manes and tails. They pranced around the ballroom, neighing and tossing their heads, while one of their number, dressed as the king, chased after them with a golden and very wobbly crown. The Queen Mother, watching from her seat of honour, laughed so hard she nearly spilled her punch. Of course, not all the jokes were so public. In the privacy of their chambers, the king's closest advisers sometimes composed limericks and riddles about their sovereign's equestrian escapades. Sir Reginald, ever the loyal friend, kept a notebook filled with the best ones, though he swore he'd never let the king see them. There once was a king from the court whose riding was always too short. He'd mount with a cheer, then land on his rear and declare, "That's enough for this sport." But what truly endeared the king to his people was his own response to the humour. Rather than take offence, King Edmund embraced the jokes, even joining in on occasion. At one harvest festival, he surprised everyone by appearing on stage with the royal jester, singing the chorus of The King and the Horse and acting out a dramatic and very exaggerated tumble. The crowd roared with laughter, and the king's willingness to poke fun at himself became legendary. This spirit of lightheartedness spread throughout the kingdom. Children played king and horse in the streets, taking turns pretending to fall off imaginary steeds. Bakers created pastries shaped like horseshoes and crowns, while tailors embroidered tiny horses onto the hems of royal garments. The story of the king who couldn't ride became a symbol of humility and joy, a reminder that even the greatest among us have their foibles. And so, in the quiet evenings, as the palace settled down for the night, the sound of laughter and song would drift through the halls. The king would sit by the fire, listening to the echoes of his people's affection, and feel a warmth greater than any crown could bestow. For in the end, it was not his skill in the saddle that defined King Edmund's reign, but his ability to unite his kingdom in laughter, kindness, and the gentle art of not taking oneself too seriously. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the soft music of the court, the gentle teasing of friends, and the laughter that fills the air when we celebrate our quirks together. Good night. and may your dreams be filled with songs, smiles, and the courage to laugh at life's little stumbles. Part 7. The Royal Artist. Portraits that lied. In the grand tradition of monarchies, the image of a king was as important as his decrees. Portraits hung in every noble house coins bore his likeness, and tapestries immortalized his greatest moments. For King Edmund the Gentle, however, these images often told a story far removed from reality, especially when it came to his supposed mastery of horsemanship. It all began with the annual commission for the royal portrait. Each year, the kingdom's finest artist was summoned to the palace tasked with capturing the king's likeness for posterity. And each year, the artist faced the same delicate challenge: how to paint a king who couldn't ride a horse, as if he were a natural-born equestrian. The first artist, Master Alaric, was a stickler for accuracy. He insisted on painting from life, setting up his easel in the palace courtyard as King Edmund attempted to pose atop Thunderclap. The result was less than regal. The king's grip on the reins was white-knuckled, his posture stiff, and his expression a mixture of hope and terror. Thunderclap, sensing his rider's unease, looked equally uncertain. When the portrait was unveiled, the court fell silent. The painting captured the truth a little too well. The king looked like he was about to leap off the horse at any moment. The Queen Mother diplomatically suggested that perhaps a more heroic pose would be preferable next time. The next artist, Mistress Isolde, took a different approach. She painted the king seated proudly on a magnificent steed sword, raised high cloak billowing in the wind. The only problem was that she used a stable boy as the model for the riding pose, and the horse was borrowed from a tapestry in the Great Hall. The result was a masterpiece, at least from a distance. King Edmund, upon seeing the portrait, chuckled. "I've never looked so confident," he remarked, eyeing the horse's impossibly flowing mane, "or so tall." Word spread quickly among the artists of the land. When painting King Edmund, a little creative license was not only allowed, but encouraged. Soon, the royal gallery was filled with images of the king performing daring feats on horseback, leaping over rivers, leading charges into battle, even taming wild stallions with a single glance. The people loved these portraits. They marveled at their king's supposed bravery and skill, never suspecting that the closest Edmund had come to such heroics was managing not to fall off Thunderclap during a slow walk around the palace gardens. But the artists' imaginations didn't stop there. One particularly ambitious painter depicted the king riding a unicorn surrounded by a halo of light. Another showed him jousting with a dragon, while yet another painted him leading a parade of dancing horses through fields of golden wheat. The royal advisors, ever mindful of appearances, encouraged these embellishments. "It's important for the people to see their king as strong and capable," Sir Reginald explained. "A little myth-making never hurt anyone." Lady Beatrice, however, saw an opportunity for mischief. She commissioned a private portrait for the king's study, a painting that showed Edmund sitting comfortably in a garden chair reading a book, while Thunderclap grazed peacefully nearby. The king loved it, declaring it the most accurate portrait ever painted. Of course, not everyone was fooled by the heroic images. The palace staff, who had witnessed the king's real-life riding attempts, took great delight in the contrast between the portraits and reality. They began a secret collection of alternative artwork sketches of the king tangled in his cloak doodles of Thunderclap, looking unimpressed, and even a cartoon of the king riding a hobby horse. At one royal banquet, the court jester unveiled a tapestry he claimed to have discovered in the archives. It showed the king in full armor valiantly leading a charge on a wooden rocking horse. The guests erupted in laughter, and even the king joined in, declaring, "At least I look comfortable in the saddle." Despite the exaggerations, the portraits served their purpose. Visitors to the palace, left with tales of the king's legendary riding skills, and foreign dignitaries sent gifts of fine saddles and jeweled spurs. The kingdom's children dreamed of growing up to be as brave as their king, though they also practiced falling off imaginary horses just in case. In time, the royal artists became ever more inventive. They painted the king riding elephants, camels, and even a particularly large sheep. Each new portrait was more fantastical than the last, and the people delighted in spotting the hidden jokes and playful details. Through it all, King Edmund maintained his good humour. He understood that the portraits were more than just images. They were stories, symbols, and a way for his people to see themselves reflected in their king. And if those stories were a little larger than life, Well, that was all part of the royal tradition. As the years passed, the gallery of royal portraits grew. Each painting told a different tale, some heroic, some humorous, all beloved. And in the quiet moments when the palace was still, King Edmund would stroll through the gallery, smiling at the images of himself as the world wished him to be. He knew the truth, of course, but he also knew that sometimes a little imagination was the greatest gift a king could give his people. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, picture a gallery filled with grand paintings, each more whimsical than the last. Imagine a king who could laugh at himself, and a people who loved him all the more for it. Good night, and may your dreams be as colourful and kind as the royal portraits of King Edmund the Gentle. King Edmund the Gentle, for all his warmth and wisdom, had a secret that rarely left the palace walls: his notorious inability to ride a horse. At home, this was a source of gentle laughter, inside jokes, and even affectionate songs. But beyond the borders of his own kingdom, the stakes were different. Foreign courts expected their visiting monarchs to display all the classic virtues, courage, dignity, and most daunting of all, equestrian prowess. The first true test came with an invitation from the neighbouring kingdom of Verdania. Their queen, renowned for her love of horses and elaborate riding displays, was hosting a week-long festival in honour of peace and friendship. The highlight, a grand parade in which every royal guest would ride through the capital's main avenue, cheered by thousands. As soon as the invitation arrived, King Edmund's advisers gathered in the council chamber. Lady Beatrice, always practical, laid out the challenge: "Sire, in Verdania, to refuse to ride is to refuse their friendship. We must find a solution." Sir Reginald, ever loyal, suggested, "Perhaps we could send a diplomatic envoy in your place, Your Majesty." But King Edmund shook his head. "No, Reginald, I will not insult our friends. I must go, and I must ride." The journey to Verdania was filled with anxious whispers and secret plans. Lady Beatrice packed a trunk full of cloaks and cushions for extra padding, sire, while Sir Reginald rehearsed emergency excuses in case disaster struck. The palace's best riding instructor, who had long since accepted the king's limitations, offered a final piece of advice. "Just stay on the horse, Your Majesty. That's all anyone will remember." Upon arrival, the Verdanian court was a spectacle of elegance and pageantry. Everywhere there were horses prancing, trotting, even dancing in formation. The Verdanian queen herself greeted Edmund with a dazzling smile and a magnificent white stallion at her side. "We are honoured by your presence, King Edmund," she declared. "Tomorrow you shall ride beside me at the head of the parade." That night, the king barely slept. He paced his chambers, reciting every riding tip he could remember. Lady Beatrice and Sir Reginald took turns offering encouragement, and when that failed, comic relief. "If you fall, sire, just wave and pretend it's a new diplomatic custom." The next morning, the palace was abuzz. Servants prepared the royal horses, tailors fussed over the king's attire, and musicians rehearsed triumphant fanfares. At the parade's starting point, King Edmund was introduced to his mount, a towering glossy black mare named Midnight. Trying to appear confident, Edmund approached Midnight with a forced smile. The mare, sensing his nerves, snorted and stamped her hoof. With the help of 2 Verdanian grooms, the king managed to mount, albeit not gracefully. He gripped the reins, sat tall, and tried to ignore the sea of expectant faces. The parade began. The queen rode with effortless grace, her horse moving in perfect time to the music. Edmund, meanwhile, focused on one thing: not falling. He waved stiffly to the crowds, who cheered with genuine enthusiasm. Every bump in the road sent his heart racing, but somehow he stayed upright. Then disaster nearly struck. A Verdanian child darted into the street chasing a runaway balloon. Midnight shied, and for a terrifying moment the king teetered on the edge of the saddle. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but just as he was about to tumble, Edmund managed to grab the pommel and steady himself. The crowd erupted in applause, mistaking his desperate maneuver for a daring act of horsemanship. The queen leaned over, her eyes twinkling. "Well done, King Edmund." Such quick reflexes. Edmund, breathless, could only nod. After the parade, the Verdanian court toasted the brave and agile king. Artists clamoured to paint his portrait, and children begged for his autograph. The story of the king who saved the parade from disaster spread like wildfire, each retelling more dramatic than the last. But not every foreign visit went so smoothly. In the mountainous kingdom of Altaria, The custom was to greet guests with a ceremonial ride up a steep, winding path to the royal fortress. The Altarian horses were small but sturdy bred for the treacherous terrain. King Edmund, determined to honour their tradition, mounted his horse with as much dignity as he could muster. The path twisted and turned, and the horse climbed steadily. But as the procession reached a particularly sharp bend, Edmund's cloak caught on a low-hanging branch. He was nearly pulled from the saddle, but a quick-thinking Altarian guard rushed forward, freeing him just in time. At the fortress, the Altarian king clapped Edmund on the back. "You ride with spirit, my friend. Not every king survives the eagle's path without a scratch." Edmund smiled secretly, vowing never to wear that cloak again. Other visits brought new challenges. In the desert realm of Sahran, the royal family rode camels instead of horses. Edmund, relieved to avoid horses for once, soon discovered that camels had their own quirks. His mount, a particularly grumpy dromedary, refused to move until bribed with dates. When it finally did, it lurched forward with such force that Edmund nearly toppled off backward. The Sarani prince laughed heartily, declaring, "You ride like a true desert king, bold and unpredictable." Back home, these tales became the stuff of legend. The palace staff collected stories of the king's foreign adventures, embellishing them with each retelling. Did you hear about the time His Majesty tamed the wild stallion in Verdania, or when he braved the eagle's path in Altaria? What about the camel race in Saran? King Edmund, for his part, learned to embrace the unpredictability of foreign customs. He realized that in the eyes of his hosts, effort and good humor mattered far more than perfection. His willingness to try, no matter how awkwardly, earned him respect and affection wherever he went. And so the king, who couldn't ride at home, became abroad a symbol of humility and courage. His embarrassments turned into triumphs, his mishaps into cherished memories. The world saw not just a king, but a man unafraid to laugh at himself, to rise after every stumble, and to greet each new challenge with an open heart. As you drift off to sleep, imagine a king journeying through distant lands, facing every test with a smile and a twinkle in his eye. May your dreams be filled with unexpected adventures, gentle laughter, and the quiet bravery to try no matter where the road may lead. Good night, and may you always find joy in the journey, even when the path is a little bumpy. After years of public tumbles, secret midnight lessons, elaborate decoy schemes, and a worldwide reputation for endearing awkwardness, King Edmund the Gentle had become a legend not just for his wisdom, but for his inability to stay atop a horse. The palace, the city, and even distant kingdoms had all found ways to turn his misadventures into laughter and affection. But there came a time when the king, weary of bruises both physical and royal, decided it was time to take matters into his own hands, or rather to take horses out of everyone else's. It began quietly, as most royal decrees do. One chilly autumn morning, as the leaves turned gold and the palace staff prepared for the annual harvest joust, King Edmund summoned his council. Sir Reginald, Lady Beatrice, and the rest of his trusted advisors gathered in the grand chamber, expecting the usual round of creative excuses, or perhaps a new diplomatic strategy for the festival. Instead, the king surprised them all. "My friends," Edmund began, "I have given this much thought. Our kingdom is known for its innovation, its kindness, and its ability to adapt. Why then must we cling to the old ways that frankly put our monarchs at risk of public humiliation and sore backsides?" The council exchanged glances. Lady Beatrice hid a smile behind her hand. "I propose," the king continued, "that we usher in a new era. An era of alternative festivities. Henceforth, all royal events requiring horseback riding shall be replaced with activities more befitting our gentle kingdom." Sir Reginald, ever the traditionalist, looked aghast. "But sire, the harvest joust, the spring parade, the summer hunt, these are the cornerstones of our culture." Edmund nodded. "And yet, are we not a people of imagination, of invention? Let us show the world that true celebration does not require saddles and stirrups." And so, with a flourish of his quill, King Edmund signed the Royal Act of Equine Alternatives. The law was clear: no more mandatory horse events for the king or anyone else who preferred their feet on solid ground. At first, the kingdom was stunned. The news spread quickly. "The king has banned horse events." Some traditionalists grumbled, but most greeted the change with curiosity. What would replace the jousts and parades that had defined their festivals for generations? The answer, as it turned out, was a burst of creativity unlike anything the kingdom had ever seen. The first event to undergo transformation was the harvest joust. Instead of knights charging at each other on horseback, the new contest featured jousting on wheels. Competitors raced down the palace lawn on elaborately decorated wheelbarrows, wielding padded lances and wearing homemade armor. The spectacle was hilarious, and to everyone's delight, far less dangerous. King Edmund himself served as the judge, awarding prizes for most dramatic tumble and best decorated wheelbarrow. The spring parade. Once a procession of prancing horses became the grand pageant of pets. Citizens dressed their dogs, cats, goats, and even ducks in royal costumes and paraded them through the city. Thunderclap. The king's infamous steed made a cameo appearance this time, pulling a tiny cart filled with flower petals, looking thoroughly pleased with his new, less strenuous role. The summer hunt was replaced by the great royal scavenger hunt. Instead of galloping through the woods, nobles and commoners alike scoured the palace gardens for hidden treasures, golden eggs, painted stones, and riddles tucked beneath rose bushes. The king joined in laughing as he crawled under hedges and emerged with leaves in his hair. As for the winter procession, it became the Festival of Lanterns. Citizens crafted glowing lanterns in every shape and size. Horses, of course, were a favorite motif and filled the streets with light and color. The king led the parade on foot, carrying a lantern shaped like a horse's head, much to the crowd's amusement. At first, some of the older nobles resisted. "It's not the same without the horses," they muttered. But as the new traditions took hold, even the most stubborn among them found themselves swept up in the fun. The kingdom's children in particular adored the changes. They invented new games, royal relay races, cloak toss, and pin the tail on the steed, and the festivals became more inclusive and joyful than ever before. Of course, not everyone was pleased. The Royal Society of Equestrian Excellence, a club of horse-loving aristocrats, staged a polite protest by riding in slow circles around the palace, holding signs that read, "Bring back the horses, and a kingdom without hooves is a kingdom half alive." The king greeted them warmly, offering lemonade and inviting them to judge the next wheelbarrow joust. Most accepted, unable to resist the infectious spirit of the new celebrations. Foreign dignitaries, hearing of the changes, sent curious letters. "Is it true your kingdom has outlawed horse events?" asked the King of Verdania. "What do you do for sport?" King Edmund replied with a detailed description of the wheelbarrow joust, and included a sketch of himself in a suit of armor made from kitchen pots. The Verdanian king was so amused that he introduced a similar event at his own court. Even the royal artists found inspiration in the new traditions. Portraits of the king now showed him surrounded by lanterns, racing in a wheelbarrow or holding a prize-winning pet duck. The tapestries in the Great Hall depicted scenes of laughter, teamwork, and the occasional intentional tumble. Through it all, King Edmund watched with satisfaction as his kingdom blossomed. The festivals became more creative, the people more united, and the laughter more genuine. No longer was the king's inability to ride a horse a source of embarrassment. It was a badge of honor, a symbol of the kingdom's willingness to change and to celebrate everyone's strengths, hoofed or otherwise. And so, in the twilight of his reign, King Edmund became known not just as the king who couldn't ride a horse, but as the king who reinvented joy. The old traditions faded, replaced by new ones that belonged to everyone. The kingdom thrived, and the people flourished, their spirits as light as the lanterns that filled the winter sky. As you drift off to sleep, imagine a kingdom where laughter is the law, where creativity reigns, and where even the most awkward tumble can spark a festival. May your dreams be filled with parades of pets, glowing lanterns, and the courage to change the world, one wheelbarrow at a time. Good night, and remember, sometimes the best revenge is a celebration that everyone can join. As the years passed, King Edmund the Gentle's reign became the stuff of legend, not for conquests or grand monuments, but for laughter, kindness, and the most unusual royal legacy in the kingdom's long history. The tale of the king who couldn't ride a horse passed from generation to generation, growing richer and more colourful with each retelling. In the great libraries, scholars debated the significance of Edmund's equine reforms. Some argued that by outlawing mandatory horse events, he had democratized royal festivities and made the palace more accessible to all. Others saw his reign as a golden age of creativity, when the kingdom's traditions evolved from rigid and exclusive to joyful and inclusive. Children wrote essays about the wheelbarrow revolution, and teachers assigned plays based on the king's most famous tumbles. But the true legacy of King Edmund was not found in dusty tomes or grand statues. It lived in the everyday lives of his people. At every festival, the echoes of his reign could be heard in the laughter of children racing in homemade armor, in the glow of lanterns drifting across the winter sky, and in the songs sung by bakers, tailors, and gardeners alike. The story of the king's riding woes became a favorite bedtime tale. Parents would tuck their children in and whisper, "Once upon a time there was a king who couldn't ride a horse, but he could make everyone smile." The children would giggle at the image of Edmund tangled in his cloak, or perched atop a runaway wheelbarrow, and fall asleep dreaming of a world where mistakes were celebrated and everyone belonged. Artists continued to paint the king in all manner of whimsical scenes, riding a parade float shaped like a duck, awarding prizes to the kingdom's best-dressed goat, or leading a lantern-lit procession through the city. The royal gallery became a place of joy, each portrait a testament to the king's ability to laugh at himself and inspire others to do the same. Even the old tapestries, once woven with images of heroic battles and mounted kings, were replaced with new ones, scenes of community invention and gentle mischief. In the palace kitchens, the staff would still hum the old songs about the king and the horse, and sometimes late at night, the royal cat could be found curled up in the king's favorite wheelbarrow. Foreign visitors marveled at the kingdom's unique customs. Some came expecting displays of martial prowess and left enchanted by lantern festivals and pet parades. They returned home with stories of a king who had turned a personal weakness into a source of national pride, and who had shown that true strength lay in humility, humor, and the courage to change. As for King Edmund himself, he grew old surrounded by friends, laughter, and the gentle affection of his people. He often strolled through the palace gardens, pausing to watch children play at royal jousting with broomsticks and wheelbarrows. He would smile knowing that his greatest legacy was not a single act, but a spirit of joy and acceptance that would outlast any monument. On the day of his passing, the kingdom held a festival of lanterns brighter than any before. People gathered in the streets, sharing stories, singing songs, and lighting lanterns in the king's honor. Thunderclap, now a venerable old horse, led the procession, pulling a flower-filled cart, just as he had in the king's favorite parade. And so history remembered King Edmund not as the king who couldn't ride, but as the king who taught his people to celebrate every fall, every laugh, and every new beginning. His story became a gentle reminder that greatness is not measured by perfection, but by the love and laughter we share. As you drift into sleep, may you carry with you the legacy of King Edmund the Gentle, a world where every stumble is met with a smile, every difference is a cause for celebration, and every heart is welcome in the parade. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with lanterns, laughter, and the gentle courage to be yourself, no matter how you ride through life.